Have you ever heard of a question that is so easy to ask that it reveals a secret that has been kept secret for hundreds of years? Something strange about the idea that even the deaths of the first people could hide a secret that has been passed down from generation to generation. A small detail that we miss in the Bible's quiet pages can change how we think about the start of history. Adam or Eve? Who left this world first? And why does this information that doesn't seem important seem to be wrapped in so much mystery? The answers to these questions tell us a lot more than just times or orders. They make us think about what part each person played in God's plan and what that means for us now. You can't put Adam and Eve's lives into a single timeline. Not only were they the first people, but they were also the first to experience the weight of disobeying God and the first to lose their life. When God said, "For you are dust, and to dust you shall return," Genesis 3:19, he wasn't just talking about a person's fate. He was setting a permanent rule, a steady warning that the breath we take can be taken away at any time. That phrase became a symbol of death. But there's something strange about this story. This is exactly how long Adam lived. Genesis 5:5 says he lived for 900 years. For Eve, there is almost no sound at all. There is no record of her death, no number, and no goodbye. This empty area, this void, brings up questions that go back hundreds of years. Is there a bigger reason for this silence, or is it just a mirror of the men-centered society of the time? The difference is very clear. Adam, who was made of clay, gets a detailed account of his life. Eve was born from a man's rib, and her life is written in big letters at important times, but her death is still a mystery. Still, they were both very important in the story of creation, the fall, and the promise of salvation. You can't fully understand one without the other. Oral stories and books that aren't believed to be true, like the Book of Jubilees, which says Eve died 6 years after Adam, fill in this gap. This knowledge, which isn't in the canonical Bible, opens up new options. What if leaving out the story of Eve's death was done on purpose? Could it be that it was there to make us look and search more closely? When we think about what the Bible is supposed to do, we understand it's not a diary-like record of events that happen in order. It was meant to teach spiritual lessons, reveal eternal ideals, and show who God is. If something is lost, it doesn't mean that it was forgotten. For some reason, it may have been kept until the right time to be found. So it's possible that the fact that Eve isn't mentioned has something to do with her role as the giver of life. Genesis 3:20 says, Adam called his wife Eve because she was the mother of all living things. The title, Mother of Humanity, is a big deal. It stands for continuation, memory, and the future, and maybe that's why the story of how she died wasn't needed. People who came after her are still affected by her life. Adam, on the other hand, stands for the start of a new reality, the world after the fall. He represents all people who have sinned and been kicked out of heaven. They are doomed to fight the earth and have to deal with sweat, tiredness, and pain. So, the story of his death can be seen as the end of a circle, with the first man returning to the dust from which he came. In a mental as well as a physical way, he was part of the earth. Both were made to care for and grow things, and to be in touch with God and the world. There was a price they had to pay when they broke that link. God said, "The ground is cursed because of you." Genesis 3:17. Nature, which had been a friend, turned into a war. Because of this, death was not the only sentence. It happened because of a shift in distance. When people chose not to follow, they were split up. At this point, though, kindness starts to show itself. In the middle of the sentence, God makes a promise. The woman's children would crush the serpent's head. Genesis 3:15. Hope, relief, and the plan for escape are talked about for the first time. Instead of thinking about who died first, we might want to think about who lived with the weight of sin and the hope of salvation the longest. Adam heard the threats and promises from God directly. He lived a long time and saw his children and grandkids make the same mistakes. Eve saw her own son Abel die because Cain was jealous of him. It was the first murder in history. She may have been badly scarred by the pain of losing a child. Even though there are no dates, you can feel Eve's pain. The woman who was told she would give birth was also the first person to feel sadness. This changes our view. Maybe it's not as important to know who died first as to understand what each death means in the human journey. Yes, both died. But more than that, they both felt the effects of the fall very deeply and set seeds that are still growing today. When we read Genesis 5, we see that the family tree goes on through Seth, who is another son of Adam and Eve, and was given by God to replace Abel. Seth also starts the family tree that leads to Noah, then Abraham, David, and finally Jesus. So this pair is at the center of the story of salvation. God still chose to work through them even after they disobeyed him. Eve's disappearance in some stories doesn't make her less important. Instead, it could be a way to keep her alive as a sign of life, continuation, and the future. Adam, whose death has been written, completes the circle of man made of clay, going back to where he came from. Both show different sides of life, the start and the continuation, the fall and the hope, the dust and the womb. What does this teach us? That even small things that aren't in the Bible can have deep meanings. That silence talks sometimes, and a healthy interest, like the kind that makes us wonder who died first, can lead to a lot more knowledge, because when we really look, we find facts that change everything. So when we think about the people who walked with God at first, but then turned away, we see that the first question is just a door. It lets us into a world full of truths about life, death, meaning, and salvation. A story that started with Adam and Eve and is still being written in all of us. Before you go any further, please like this video and subscribe to our channel if you like finding secret truths in the Bible and value thought-provoking content. This will help us reach more people with words like these. Also, make sure the bell is on so you don't miss any new post. Also, if you want to help this work, please think about leaving a thank you. We can keep telling more Bible stories and spreading this message of faith and hope thanks to your gift. Thank you so much for your help. Let's keep going on our trip today. The dust that kept life going was now a sign of the end. For you are dust, and to dust you shall return. Genesis 3:19. This is a saying that has been used throughout history. This sentence not only changed Adam and Eve's lives, but it also colored our own. The earth, which used to give food without any work, would now be worked with blood, tears, and pain. With each crop, people would be reminded of how weak, short-lived, and dependent they are on God. Eve, on the other hand, was given a role that went beyond the land of Eden. Eve stood for the future, while Adam stood for the beginning and the link to the world. And Adam called his wife Eve, it says in Genesis 3:20. She was the mother of all living things. As a mother, Eve did more than just give birth to children. It brought with it the weight of a new cycle. A new generation of people would be born with the weight of death, but also the hope of being saved. Right now, this is the point where the story stops being just an old tale and starts to reflect our own lives. In this short life, there is loss, choice, and action. Adam and Eve learned the price of choice when they knew the difference between good and evil. In Eden, they were free, but that freedom did not come without responsibilities. It asked for trust, and because they didn't believe what God said, they broke the clearest link between people and God that had ever existed. It wasn't forced on the snake to seduce. It was only an idea, though. You're not going to die for sure. At first glance, the words seemed freeing, but they were actually poison meant to trick. Eve saw the fruit, ate it, and wished she was wise. Adam took part in the action that would mess up the original plan of fellowship when he ate the same fruit. Error was not the only thing that let sin in. It made a new reality: death, separation, and pain. Because of this sin, the gods cursed both of them, and the effects of those curses can still be felt today. Eve's parenting, which used to bring her nothing but happiness, would now bring her pain. Genesis 3:16 says, "I will make your labor and birth much more painful. You will have children through pain." The fall had physical and mental effects that are still felt today, as shown by every contraction and tear of a mother giving birth. It was also going to happen to Adam. "Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil, you will eat food from it all the days of your life," says Genesis 3:17-18. "It will grow thistles and thorns for you." Work, which used to be a way to show purpose and connect with the world around you, turned into hard work that was marked by anger and effort. Not only would people suffer, but the earth, which is a sign of God's support, would also start to break down. "By the sweat of your brow you will eat your bread until you return to the ground from which you were taken." This is the last warning. In heaven, death seemed far away, but it would soon become the most certain thing in the world. But even though things are hard, there is one amazing thing: kindness. God was fair and made sure the penalties were met, but he also showed his kindness. He gave them clothes to cover their body, even in Eden, Genesis 3:21, showing that he would not leave them even after the fall. The way God feels about this is a turning point. There was justice, but hope was not lost. In that line, God made the first promise about the Messiah. In Genesis 3:15, he says, "I will make you and the woman enemies, and your children will be enemies with her children. He will bruise your head, and you will bruise his heel." A omen with a cover over it, a light in the darkness. The woman's children would defeat evil, but it would cost a lot. As of that moment, Adam and Eve were no longer the first people ever. They came to stand for the start of both the fall and the rise in hope. Because their lives were now limited by time, they became like ours. They started to feel the weight of what they had lost as the years went by, being in direct contact with God, the perfection of the world. The tree of life can be reached without any problems. Eve, the first mother, went through a kind of pain that no curse could have predicted. Her own brother killed a child. Death stopped being a vague idea when Cain killed Abel. It turned into a loss that can't be fixed. Eve saw what would happen if she sinned, and she felt it in her body, her soul, and her heart. With each step after the fall, it seemed like the tragedy that started in Eden was brought to mind again. For his part, Adam lived for 1,030 years. Years that saw the number of people grow, but also the number of acts of violence, isolation, and pain. As his children and grandchildren grew, he also saw what it meant to be separated from God. In Genesis 5:5 it says, "And Adam lived for a total of 960 years, and he died." A short term that ends the life of the person who showed him a world without sin. What about Eve, though? It's still quiet. It doesn't say in the line how or when she died. Not having them is not a small thing. It's a spiritual question. Why doesn't the Bible say that she died? Could it be a sign that she will still play a part in the story? Or maybe a call to look deeper than the words on the page and find spiritual meanings? Some stories, like the Book of Jubilees, say that Eve died 6 years after Adam. A peaceful death at the end of a long life is also talked about in other Jewish customs. But none of these forms were added to the canon of the Bible, and maybe that's where the mystery lies. Eve doesn't have a known ending, which could mean that her impact goes beyond life and death. She is still a sign of continuity, fertility, and hope that lasts even when things are hard. Adam stands for the start of mankind, sin, and the need to be saved. Eve stands for the future, the life that will come, the generations that will grow, and the family that will one day give birth to the Savior. Together, they didn't just act out a story. They were the conflict between sin and forgiveness, between right and wrong. Romans 5:12 says again that Adam was linked to the beginning of sin. Therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, and death through sin, and this is how death came to everyone. And at a later time, though, the Apostle Paul shows the difference. For just as one man's offense brought judgment on all men to condemnation, so one act of righteousness brought judgment on all men to life. Adam caused death. Christ gave us life. Eve, who is in the middle of this trip, stands for all people who wait, suffer, and hope. Her story doesn't end when she is kicked out of Eden. It goes on because of the promise that the seed of the woman would crush the head of the snake, the hope for peace, and the search for God's presence. We understand that the circle is over as we think about Adam's death. The person who came from dust went back to being dust. But as we think about Eve, the Bible may have decided to be quiet to show that life goes on, that there is hope even when things are bad, that even though people fell, there is still hope for them. So, let's keep going, taking in the breath that was once drawn into Adam's nose, taking on the traits of Eve, the mother of all people, living in the middle of the truth of dust and the hope of heaven, because if death came through one, then life came through another. We were given life so that we would never be apart from God's love again. The Bible says Adam lived for 1,030 years and then died. This line is very easy, but it has a lot of meaning. In a few words, it sums up the life of the first man who saw the beauty of Eden with his own eyes and heard the voice of God. Even after the fall, he still remembered the heaven he had lost. The line not only ends his life, but it also starts a truth that he could not escape. Death is now a part of being human. The record of Adam's death is not found by itself. It's part of a history that starts in Genesis 5 and goes on with more names and stories. In every age that is talked about, the sentence, "and he died," is said over and over again. This repeat isn't just for show. Line after line, it makes the effect of the first violation stronger. Because of sin, death was able to come in and stay. Adam lived for 930 years, which seems very long these days, but that didn't stop him from turning back into dust. Death didn't care about the first person born or his children and grandchildren. The cycle was set in stone. Adam did not avoid the sentence that God spoke after the fall. "For you are dust, and to dust you shall return." Genesis 3:19. He lived for hundreds of years. Long life was not a full gift. Instead, it was an extra amount of time to see the hurts of a sin-tainted world. Adam had to deal with the weight of memory for almost 1,000 years. He had lived in a world without pain, death, or being apart from other people. In the cool evening, he walked with God. He then knew shame, being kicked out and breaking. Every morning brought the thought of what had been lost. Through his eyes, he saw both the growth of people and the growth of evil. Cain's blood on Abel was the greatest sign of what happened because of sin. As a father, Adam felt the sharp pain of loss and the quiet guilt of the beginning. Adam wasn't just the first person to be born. He became a sign of how bad people have become. His death, which is clearly mentioned in the Bible, is more than just a fact of history. It is a major step in theology. Paul makes this deep link in Romans 5:12. Therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man and death through sin, so death came to everyone in this way. Adam stands for the start of evil, the breaking of beauty, and the start of a path that would end hundreds of years later on the cross. But the difference between Adam and Jesus, the so-called last Adam, 1 Corinthians 15:45, shows us that Adam's death was not the end, but the start of a bigger plan. Adam's life, his mistakes, and his death all set the stage for the coming of the Savior. Adam caused division, but Christ would bring peace. But the Bible doesn't say anything about how Eve died. It only talks about how Adam died. This difference is very noticeable. Why don't we find the end of the life of the person who was called the mother of all living, Genesis 3:20, among all the carefully written details? Is it a coincidence that she isn't in the text, or is there a spiritual plan that makes us think about something deeper? There have been questions for hundreds of years about why Eve's death isn't addressed. With a society that valued male records and families that gave men more weight, it makes sense that her name wasn't included in the list of generations. But Eve wasn't just any woman. She was the first. They were the first to see the world bloom, the first to have a child, the first to feel the pain of giving birth, and the first to lose a child to violence. Eve carries a special kind of spiritual weight. She stands for the start of motherhood, people, and hope. God not only let her live after the fall, but he also told her that one of her children would be the one to crush the serpent's head. The first Messiah promise can be found in Genesis 3:15. I will make war between you and the woman, and between your children and her children. The text is mostly about the woman as the way to be saved, as the link between the fall and the resurrection. So, the fact that no one has said anything about her death may be more important than it seems. Instead of focusing on her end, the Bible asks us to think about her part in God's plan. Eve, as the mother figure of all people, goes beyond the family tree. She finds a way to connect the lost Eden with the promised Savior. The important thing about her is not how her life ended, but what she stands for. In the Bible, Eve is related to Mary, who was the mother of Jesus. Throughout the history of Christianity, many scholars have seen this connection. Just like sin came into the world through Eve, the one who would save us came into the world through Mary. The first woman, who stands for the fall, can be seen in the young woman who said yes to the angel and gave birth to the Savior. This difference points to a deep restoration. What started with one woman disobeying was made right by another woman obeying. Then, Eve's removal from the generations can be seen as part of a bigger plan, where the promise is just as important as the flesh. No one forgot about Eve. She was raised. These are the things that will remember her, the lives that came from her, and the hope that would one day come through her. The question still stands. How did Eve die? In her last days, what did she see? How long did she live? Did she see the rise of different cultures? Did she watch her kids, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren grow up? Did she feel sad about the deaths of other kids? Did she laugh at babies that were like fresh starts? That's not something we know. In fact, that might be what makes her story so powerful. We do know that Eve had to deal with the weight of her decisions and the hope of a promise. In her own body, she felt the pain of loss and the warmth of new life. She had a child, was married, and lived in a world that was still getting used to being a world. Her story doesn't have a clear finish. It lives on in the women who came after her, in the mothers who fight, in the people who wait, and in the people who think that something new is possible. The silence in the Bible is not a blank. It is a call to look past words, to pay attention to what hasn't been said, to understand that even when something is missing, it is still there, having a story that goes beyond death and points to forever. Since Adam's death was written, it means that a circle is over. Eve's life, whose death is not addressed, stands for continuation. He stands for people who fail. She stands for people who fight back. These two elements come together to make a story that still moves, challenges, and changes us today. So when we think about the story in Genesis, we see that Adam's death is more than just the end of a long life. It's a warning that sin has real effects, and that there needs to be a careful, long-term plan for salvation. As we think about Eve, we realize that the silence around her death may be the most quiet and powerful way to say that her life has not ended. It lives on in every new life, every renewed hope, and every seed of faith placed in a person's heart. Genesis 5 gives us Seth's family tree, which at first glance looks like a boring list of names, ages, children, and deaths. It does, however, show a lot more than just historical information. Each name stands for a life, a generation, or a quiet lineage that goes back to Adam and Eve, the very beginning of mankind. The choice to focus on the male lineage comes from an old cultural and social framework where men were the main carriers of property, power, and memory. But the lack of talk about women, especially Eve, doesn't mean they aren't important. On the other hand, what a writer leaves out can have a spiritual meaning. Paul says that Adam is the portal through which sin and death came into the world, Romans 5:12. His death is correctly recorded, and his name is easy to find in the records. Eve, on the other hand, was the first person the snake spoke to, but she also represents something else. not the fall, but the seed of hope. God makes a promise about women in Genesis 3:15, "And I will make war between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed." More than anything else, this sentence makes Eve a sign of how people will be saved in the future. Her job is more than just being the first wife and mother. Eve stands for the hope of the Messiah and the continuation of life. And maybe that's why the Bible doesn't write down that she died. The story isn't about how her life came to an end. It's about the seed that would grow through her. It goes from being an account to a sign, from being about history to being about spirituality. But people have always wanted to fill in the blanks that holy books leave out. One non-canonical Jewish work that gives a different version is the Book of Jubilees. It says that Eve died 6 years after Adam. This information isn't mentioned in the Bible, but it shows how people in later times tried to fill in the blanks that the Bible didn't say. The goal is to make things more human, to end loops, and to close what was left open. The stories that try to explain where Adam and Eve are buried show the same need for clarity. Muslims and Jews both say that their bodies were buried in the cave of Machpelah in Hebron, which is also where Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Rebekah, Jacob, and Leah were buried later. This story has a strong symbolic layer that comes from this custom, whether it is true or not. The first things that were made would rest with the people who would become the chosen country. The beginning and the beginning of a new life came together in the same ground. The Jewish Midrashic story also gives us a powerful picture. God buried Adam himself. This idea, which isn't in the sacred writings, shows that death is a good thing, even after sin. God did not leave his creation, even though the fall had effects. He cared for it until the end. This vision makes it clear that the Creator is forgiving and caring. This is a God who addresses but also covers, clothes, and buries. So death is no longer the end punishment. It is now a shift, a time when God's hand is still with us. This view is especially strong in the Jewish faith, where death is seen as both the product of sin and an important part of the plan for renewal. For the Hebrews, eternity is not just a future event. It's also a way to reconnect with God after being physically separated. When we look at Eve, the silence before she leaves might not have been an accident, but something that was done on purpose. At different places in the Bible, story breaks are used to help people think. What isn't said often makes people think more deeply than what is written down. Since Eve isn't in the ending story, we have to wonder what her life meant. What did her influence lead to? What does her story make us think about? Eve is more than just a figure from the past. She stands for every aspect of being a woman, the woman who fights, gives birth, suffers, and believes. Her impact on religion, spirituality, and the path of salvation goes back hundreds of years. Her name is not in the line in Genesis 5, but she is where they all came from. And the fact that no one said anything about her death may have been done to keep her image alive as a sign of hope and continuation. We can also think about the role of women in the Bible when we think about this call to thought. In a society ruled by male records, strong women like Eve, Sarah, Rebekah, Miriam, Deborah, Ruth, Esther, Hannah, and Mary stand out. They have an effect that lasts even if they are only stated quickly. They are the quiet supports of the story in the Bible. As a matter of fact, the story of salvation often moves forward through them. A lot of religious people call Mary, Jesus' mother, the new Eve. In the same way that Eve was there at the start of the fall, Mary was there at the start of the coming back together. Both of them heard a holy word that would change the course of history. Both said yes to God's call, but in very different situations. The spiritual connection between these two women shows that God has always seen women as important to his plans. There are more than just religious aspects to think about. There are also culture and archaeological aspects. The way people in the old Middle East handled funerals can help us understand how they thought about life and death. In the city of Ur, where Abraham was born, for example, tombs have been found that clearly show the difference between graves for men and women. Men's tombs were often more detailed and came with status symbols, which shows how important the male figure was in the culture. This situation helps us understand why the Bible gives Adam's name more weight than Eve's when it comes to death. But that doesn't make her less important. On the contrary, it makes her look wider. Eve's goal, not her grave, is what makes her who she is. The quiet around her death is a call to see her life in terms of forever, not just the end of her body. Archaeological finds from other places like Mari and Ebla show that even in countries with many gods, people thought there was life after death. Their views, on the other hand, were mostly about sad, meaningless lives. The Hebrew faith, on the other hand, talks about a full restoration and a future life where people will be able to reconnect with God again. A promise of forever is not just an eternity, but an eternity with a plan. As seen in this picture, Eve is an important part of the promise. It is impossible to ignore her part in the lineage of the Messiah. Even though she isn't named among her children and grandchildren, she is in all of them. The child who would crush the snake's head would come from her belly. The most important thing about her is not the ending of her life story, but the effect her life had on people forever. Finally, we can't ignore the way that the fact that her death isn't written shows us how to understand the Bible. The Bible is not a book with all the answers. Instead, it asks us to study, listen, and be spiritually aware. Not having something doesn't mean it isn't important. It means we need to change the way we look and feel. Eva will always be remembered in the hearts of people. People remember her not for how she died, but for what she left behind: life, hope, and continuation. And maybe that's the most important lesson of all. How someone dies doesn't matter as much as what they leave behind in the hearts of those they touched. In a time when funeral monuments showed how important the dead were, and when complicated practices were popular to keep the memory of the dead alive, the Bible takes a different path. The Bible doesn't focus on tombs and times of death. Instead, it talks about God's ultimate plan. This is even more clear when you look at Adam and Eve. They were not honored for their graves, but for what their lives did and what they promised to do for all people. They went on travels that went beyond time and are deeply rooted in the spiritual past of all people. This point of view asks us to think about the cultural, social, and spiritual factors that affected how these stories were written and passed down, in addition to the exact text. When the Bible is quiet, especially when it comes to Eve's death, it's not because the authors forgot, but because they meant to. This way of telling a story makes us think about how important life is, not for how it ends, but for what it leaves behind forever. Thoughts about who died first come up in this thought. According to one school of thought, Adam died before Eve because of a more direct and physical curse. There is a curse on the ground because of you. You will have to work hard to eat from it all the days of your life. Genesis 3:17. Adam has had a relationship with the ground since the beginning of time. He came from dust and will return to dust. As part of his penalty, he had to work non-stop and fight every day to provide, which could have sped up his physical decline. The sweat on his forehead, the weight of the angry earth, and his constant tiredness all point to a slow death in which the body slowly breaks down. Adam was in charge of more than just feeding his family. For many people, he became a figure of the man who is responsible to both his family and God. Nature, which had helped him before, now wanted him to be strong, tough, and in pain. His bond with the earth was strong, but also heavy. One could reasonably think that this connection had an effect on when and how he died. On the other hand, some readings say that Eve was the first person to leave. Some experts say that the mental weight she carried could have been terrible, even though the Bible doesn't say it directly. As it says in Genesis 3:16, "I will greatly increase your pain in childbearing. With pain you will give birth to children." The pain of giving birth would be reason enough to mark her way with suffering. However, Eve had to deal with something even worse: Cain had killed her son, Abel. Being a mother and seeing her child die is the worst pain in the world. It hurts even more when the child's brother killed them. Being filled with guilt, sadness, and a sense of hopelessness as she watched her own family fall apart could have had a huge effect on her health and spirit. As Eve watched her children behave, she could see the direct results of the choices she made in Eden. The breakup affected more than just the spirit world. It also affected family, relationships, and the body. This makes us think that her death, even though it wasn't written down, may have been marked by all of that pain. But it doesn't matter who died first. What matters is what this conversation shows us about people. The question, who died first, may not seem important at first, but it gives us a chance to think deeply about our own deaths. Rome 3:23 says, "All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." Death is just the body's way of showing that there is a soul split that's